Here's another thing I really miss, by the way, for you corporate types. That's what this is. And so for the rest of you, just kind of go, oh, here he goes off again. But one of the things I really missed is that I used to have this incredible team that would spend all night long. We would just pay them to spend all night long writing after we would redline everything. It was just this big pool of people that would work. So they would just bring me back, another rough copy of what I wrote, and then I'd redline it all, just go crazy, and then send it back to them, and it would come back to me. We'd do this like 4 or 5 revisions, but it took them hours and hours. It just took me a few minutes. And I always thought, that's pretty special. And it's one thing that I love as a teacher too. I love to go through and kind of help people craft, wordsmith, if you will. But as you well know, it's not easy, is it? It's just getting it down on paper. How many of you have heard, and I think appropriately so, you need to write that. You need to write the story of your life. Well, folks, it's not that easy, nor is it always that compelling to everyone. I mean, we all think it is, and I think for us it certainly is, and that's absolutely fine. I think it's very compelling for people that are close to us. They want to know a little bit about Grandpa and a little bit about Grandma, and what did they do? So yesterday I'm with a guy. This is a true story. I know you're not going to think it's true, but he was here at St. John Neumann. We do First Friday calls. I love First Friday calls, and it's a tradition in our church that we've had for hundreds and hundreds of years. And I never met this person before, so I go in there, and he's having memory loss, and maybe some of you know. So I hope I don't say too many personal things. But I'm sitting down with him, and his wife is just trying to be very, very, attentive, and they've been married 63 years. I think they're both in their late 80s, maybe early 90s. And he says to me, do you know John Kennedy? And I go, I don't know. Like, as in President John F. Kennedy? Yes. He said, we're friends. Now remember, he's losing his mind and dementia, all these various things, so I don't know. But I want to just tell you, toward the end of this visit with him, he knew John F. Kennedy. Okay? And so just stay with me for a little bit. So I'm listening to his story, and he says to me, I come from Savannah. So I'm thinking, Georgia, right? Okay? And he says, no, Savannah, Illinois. So we start talking about the Army Depot there in St. John the Baptist. And he kind of comes in and out, but he's enough that he can stay with me. And some of you probably know who I'm talking about. And so then he says to me, and then my buddy, my World War II buddy, he was with the Flying Tigers, so we started this airline. And Flying Tigers, as you know, their hub was here in Chicago, but they flew all over the United States. Well, I saw the planes in his living room and these various things, and he would do all this air routes, for all over the country. And I'm going, this is pretty cool. And then he says to me, but I want to tell you how this began, and it began on a PT boat. And then I find out that his wife and he were invited to John F. Kennedy's inauguration as President of the United States because he stayed close to the guys that were on his PT boat. Now, I know you've seen PT 109 and you've seen all these various things, but I'm going, okay, is this guy for real? And so he starts to tell me about, the Philippines and New Guinea, but remember, this was over a long time because he could stay with it for a couple of minutes, and then he would lose where he was, and then he would come back to it. But it was just an amazing story to hear him talk about these various things and the importance of his Catholic faith in all of this and what got him through all of this. But, those stories are just so precious, and how do we allow them to be carried down to the next generations? And what does it say about friendship and loyalty? And what does it say about, he must have been just he was a Navy man, obviously, young kid. And this had to scare the bejeebies out of him, with all of that going on. And so, as he was talking, he said, we helped save John F. Kennedy. Because his boat was obviously, and we pulled him out, and I'm going, this is awfully cool. So those are the stories, and that's what I want to just talk a little bit about. To find integrity in life, to see your true self, is to look back on your personal narrative and determine that for all of its faults, all of its difficulties, it's good. It's good. a significant element in finding the value of our life story is how we're oriented toward others and our concern for those who come before us. Very important. My mom is a genealogist, and she teaches sometimes down in Chicago, sometimes at NIU. She's 82, and people come into the store. She still works, but to historical, and they want to know. Like, she's written a couple books about our town and about her family and about other, and they're hardbound books. And people will come into her and say, not just those commercials, on TV about how finding all your lineage, but how do I write all this out? And she just loves it. And so, like, a great day in her life would be for one of her children or grandchildren to say, Grandma, tell me about this person and about that person. And that we've done a little bit of our own research and a little bit of our, not just come and patronize her, but actually to really engage her. And she just loves to open up. Like, one day she was telling us, she says, kids, you really should be independently wealthy. And we're saying, really? She says, yeah, do you know this relative of yours owned downtown Pittsburgh? We thought, shoot, I want to hear more of that, because maybe we can. She said, the trouble was, he was a scoundrel. He cheated everybody. And so then we kind of retracted real quick. But the fact is, you need to know those stories as well of your backgrounds. And describing the grace of old age as experiencing the integrity of one's life story is to reach old age and to reject the gift of one's own story can really almost lead to despair. We need to embrace that story. Many of the great saints and spiritual writers kept journals. As we've talked about Confessions of St. Augustine. It appears to draw upon journals that he kept. The same is true of Henry Cardinal Neumann. In his Apologia pro Vita Sua, it was published early in the last century. As I said, Teresa of Lisieux, Journey of the Soul, was an important spiritual writing for the 19th century. Thomas Merton, this popular Cistercian spiritual writer of the last century, he kept his journals, he published them. I think his journals are among his best writing. And I think that's also apparent in the works of Henry Nouwen. Anybody ever read him? I just think that those are the best. So the journal is similar to a diary, in that it is maintained on a daily basis, if possible. It differs from a diary in that it is not just the recording of events, but it's a reflection on those events. So a spiritual journal looks at the spiritual implications of the events of the day. It also is a way to record and consider the inner movements of the person. If a person is angry or frustrated with God or anyone else, then they can freely express this, and no one else needs to read it. In fact, I so encourage people in spiritual direction to write this letter and then rip it up. So you're angry, so you're bitter, and that's okay. And then I remember my first time, well, actually it was my second time. My first time was probably my junior year in high school, and I don't know why, but I just looked at this mirror, and it was when I went from borrowed faith to owned faith. And I looked in the mirror and I said, Mom and Dad, and all you people, I am sick and tired of you cramming your faith down my throat. Anybody ever been through this moment? Okay, so I'm like 16 years old, 17 years old, and I'm just going through all this thing, and all of a sudden the tears start coming, and I'm crying, and I'm going, you know what? It's time for me to embrace my own faith. And so as I'm going through this period, and I said, and the faith that I want to embrace is the faith you gave me. Now, how does that work? But I needed to do that. And then my next moment is I remember going to the hospital. I was a seminarian in college. I was a sophomore. And this little girl was like 14, 13. And she had a priest, uncle, who was in the Philippines. And I would go there, and she was dying of cancer. And I started out first by going there for a short time, and then it became more and more and more because her parents would say to me, she just found such comfort in that visit. And I suspect if you wanted to be a psychologist, she was just really growing deep because she was dying and knew that. And so being in the seminary, I had some access to depth, but I wasn't there. So spiritually, I just think she really found a companion. And I don't think it hurt that I was male. I don't think that hurt. But it just did. It just really worked. And I wasn't scared to hear what she had to say about some of the moments of darkness or even some of despair or even, it was a whole range of things that she was going through. But I was doing this. And of course, in my world, it was simply act of charity. I was in the seminary, so it was fine. And with all my superiors and everybody was fine by it. And so then they told me the news. They called me and said, she's dead. Oh my. I went into that chapel, thank God, it was like 10 o'clock at night, and I erupted. I just went bonkers. I don't mean I threw myself or anything, nothing like that. I just was right there, and I just let God have it. I mean, full blast. I let him have it. And I just said, this stinks, a little more than that. And I just go. And every once in a while I had this sense, maybe I've overstepped my bounds, And it wasn't that I had a God that was going to crush me or he was going to stomp me or somehow, no, I didn't feel that. But I just felt, I never really told anybody off like this, and it just happened to be God. And I'm just ripping. I mean, I'm ripping, and no exaggeration. I was like hoarse because I didn't decide to do it quietly. So thank God it was late. It was, like I said, this chapel that was, and I'm just screaming and yelling, and I'm going, this is just absolutely ludicrous, and all that. And so I wore myself out. And so then I just find myself I don't know, I was just, thank God I got up before they came in for morning prayer, but I was just laying there. I was just exhausted in the pew. And so I got up and I go, I got to quickly go back, and get myself ready for the next day. And the next day they bring this chalice from the Philippines. It's done on a lathe that's wooden. And that was before they got into all this discrepancy about whether you couldn't have a wooden chalice, you couldn't have a wooden chalice, etc. Remember, it's a long time ago. I'm really old. And but it was done by her uncle, who was the priest in the Philippines, and she had commissioned it. And she said, her parents said, this was her gift to you. And thank God I got all that out of my system the night before, because I think I would have erupted again, and said, this stinks and this is so wrong. But I would keep that chalice, that she gave me. But I just felt that was so important to do, is to just lay myself out there. That's something, sometimes you want to go and visit those moments, revisit them, if you will, of which you had real spiritual darkness and real, you were just empty and those, and know that God stays faithful. Know that he sees me as a beloved son. Know that he embraces me in all this anger, and that he's not going to crush me for letting him have it. Merton was accessible to me in that way. So if you're angry, you're frustrated with God or anyone else, then just freely express it. And then, if there are doubts, they can be openly explored. If one is struck by the beauty of a particular experience, or this palpable feeling of the presence of God, the feelings of joy and excitement should be captured. And I know you can do it in photos, et cetera, et cetera. I get all that. And even the most secular of activities, you can report, as long as they're considered in light of the Spirit. So one of your classmates, Jan just came up to me and she wanted to tell me the story. She just gave this to me now. Tell me the story of the artist and when he did it and how he did it and how he did 3 different, that story needs to be captured and needs to be written. It probably is. But those are defining moments in our lives. Those are incredible gifts to us from God that will give us what we need. I have to tell you here at St. John Neumann, not that I haven't been struck at other places, but I am so acutely aware of God's grace. And I'm so amazingly honored that it's coming through you. You guys are an incredible gift of grace to me. It's just unbelievable. You know, you come here and you go, you're kidding me. You know, I was set for life at St. Rita. You know, believe it or not, they loved me. And I love them. And I'm not saying everybody. That's not what I'm saying. And I'm not saying that they weren't detracted. I'm not saying that, you know, I'm anything special, because I truly am not. But you ever notice sometimes chemistry is chemistry? And, you know, I don't know why. Maybe it was their timing, maybe it was my timing, but I think it was God's timing. It all gelled. It all gelled. You can tell everybody I'm wrong. But let me just tell you, that was the easiest, smoothest transition I have ever made in my priesthood. And it was all for a reason. But you guys, the first couple of months, if another person from St. John Neumann came up to me and said, "Are you okay?" I was ready to kick them. No, I'm not okay. This hurts. And I pray with all my heart that if and when I am ever moved for St. John Neumann, it hurts. Because if it doesn't hurt, it means that I didn't love. That I didn't really invest. I didn't really risk. And let me just tell you, there's some moments in my life I want to shut down. This is my last rodeo, you know? I'll say, I'm not doing this again. And then all of a sudden, He brings people like you into my life, and I go, what was I thinking? You know, am I stupid? The answer is yes, but God is not. He's not. He's faithful. And His grace pours through you. It just pours through you. And so again, this class may not even be for you today, but man, let me tell you, it was just exactly what Jesus had in store for me. It was exactly what we need to do. And tomorrow, it'll be my third session with this group of bandits, you know, these teenagers. And it's exactly what Jesus had in store for me. But, you know, in my own self-absorption, I want to say, I'm too busy. I don't have time. And besides, they're probably not going to get anything out of this. You know how you do all that banter? Well, write all that down. When we first turn to this topic of self-awareness, this is what I've been kind of laying out there, seeds, the last couple of sessions. And we talked about the importance of remembering where one comes from, remembering one's own personal history. You know, it becomes obvious as we turn to the role of personal narrative in giving substance to our identity. This is who we are. Where we came from is a part of our story, and it's integral with the person that we are today. How did I ever know I would come back to St. Charles? How? There are so many places, and you know, I've told you this story before, but the diocese is very careful never to send a priest back to his native Scripture, folks. A prophet is not welcomed. All right? So some of you will say, this happens, remember, this is just because it's a small little parish in Aurora. They'll tell me from time to time, wait a second, we're this little bitty parish, very, very poor. St. Peter's, you know, in Aurora is where I'm from, because you know, you're from that area, and the Benedictines serve it so well. And they just keep cranking out vocations. And the people there keep saying, but why can't we keep you, you know? Or why can't we keep sister? Or why can't we keep, you're from us. So why do we send you out? And sometimes when some bonehead comes up to you and says that you're a poor excuse for a priest, you want to tell him. You know? But no, that's the Holy Spirit. And so it's important when we come, where we come from, yesterday's challenges, successes, loves, joys, failures, losses, dreams, they're brought up to this point in the road in which we find ourselves today. If you get a chance and you're from St. John Neumann, make sure you come to this Advent mission. Even if you're not from St. John Neumann, make sure you come to this Advent mission from Deacon Willie. Some of you read his blog about El Camino, you know, the way to Santiago de Compostela. And he talks about this. And he says to me, hey, what do we use for a title? And you know, we had a vicar for clergy. You ever heard the book, The Road Less Traveled? It was written by Scott Peck, okay, M. Scott Peck. Well, he called me Scott my whole priesthood. He could have called me Gregory, Peck, Gregory Peck. Get it? Okay. But he called me Scott all the time because of this M. Scott Peck. But not a bishop yet. Deacon Willie is given this mission, and why don't you put the way less traveled? And I just saw and he did, because that speaks to us so much. You've read Robert Frost, that the road that I chose was the one less traveled. It's very, very true. To remember our past is to integrate it into our today. It brings us healing when we have forgotten or we repressed a past experience, resulting in disintegration. It brings insight when we come to explore life's experiences to discover patterns previously overlooked, which brings greater integrity to our life story. And I hate to keep going off on tangents, but do you remember I told you, and this was very risky, I went to my mom, and moms, especially those of you who have oldest sons, maybe I'm weird, but I don't think so. There's an incredible, incredible bond. I mean, she knows intuitively. She will call me and text me and do whatever exactly at the moment. She picks this up. So I go to her, and this is in front of my dad, which my dad just rolls his eyes about this relationship. It's just amazing. And I said, Mom, I think I was called from your womb. I think I was called to be a priest when you were conceiving me. And my dad, he just hangs in there. He's such a great guy. He just accepts anything. Because my mom and I get really deep, into our feelings and emotions. And I just trust her with my life, She will never make fun of me, never. Not publicly. And so I tell her this, and she thinks about it. She has to spend some time, It's about 15 minutes later. She says to me, honey, I just asked God, and I just thought back, yes, you were called from my womb. And I thought, I'm not a freak. I'm not some weirdo that comes up with these ideas. And you start to see life, and you see that's what God was always calling me to be. Even though you went off on different roads, It brings insight when we can explore life's experience and discover these patterns. Remembering the past, even those painful elements that have left us wounded, is a means to healing those wounds. Part of the process of spiritual growth is the development of greater self-discernment. That's what this course is called for the teenagers, by the way, Discerning God's Call. Discernment is a pretty deep concept, actually. This includes being able to perceive and acknowledge negative motivations, negative perceptions. You've got to embrace those as well, folks. A multitude of devices and masks are used. I know I use them in hiding this phenomena. For example, denial and avoidance and blaming others and compensation and projection and so on. I remember talking a little bit, Doc, to your daughter and Becky, and I was saying to her, when I started to come out of myself from this extremely shy person, is your wife. Sorry, Eric. I started talking to her, and I said to her, it was when I started to do theater. It's when I started to get on stage. And all of a sudden I could go into these personas. I could become these people that I never had the courage to become. So they were making me, because I could dance a little bit, I could sing a little bit, very little bit, by the way. They were making me generals, and they were making me, I was doing brigadoon, I was doing all these various things. And I was going to these characters. And I was finding that I could stay in character, even obviously they were really encouraging me to do that, because I didn't really know that much in high school. But they were saying, stay in character, stay in character. And even when we were behind the set, we were, stay in character, stay in character. And all of a sudden it got real fun to stay in character, because I liked being the character. And then it was kind of disappointing when I would come back and I had to come out of character, because I thought that was larger than life. But it helped me to come out of myself. The big thing is that when we're priests, don't go into character on the altar. What a huge temptation. You want to get your top hat and your cane, because some people will say that to you. And that's right from the pit of hell. Boy, Father, I loved how you entertained. Boy, Father, I loved how you just worked us up. Boy, Father, I liked, how you got us all in a frenzy. Boy, Father, that was high energy, Man, you've got to be so careful. Why do you think we have a cross on the altar? Why do you think we have a cross here? For your sake. My sake is back here. You see that big cross? That's what I look at, because it's too easy to get distracted and to totally forget what I'm doing. And you say, you're pathetic. Amen. I am. I get distracted. I see things and go, we have to be so careful. So we say these various prayers. One of the prayers that we say every time before we say Mass, remember, O priest of God, that you say this Mass as if it were your first Mass. What would that be like? Your first one, scared to death. Your last Mass, what will it be like the last Mass I ever say? I remember being with Father Don. Father Don was ordained a year early because he had cancer. And Bishop ordained him. And I'm there with him, and I'm there at his last Mass. He's got a tray, he's got the altar on his stomach. And we're saying Mass together, his last one. Oh, wow. Say it as if it's your last Mass, and then say it as if it were your only Mass. So I've got 3 Masses this weekend, right? Wouldn't it be easy for me to go, oh man, 1 down, 2 to go. Oh man, 2 down, just 1 to go. How pathetic is that? But how real that can be. Like we're on autopilot, What a huge mistake. Huge mistake. Some people will say to me, and it's just people talking, right? They'll say to me, you know what? Why do you need to pray after communion? Can't you just leave? How can I not pray after communion? How can I not? It's amazing. Do I realize who I have received? And I become what I receive. Holy cow. In addition to the psychological and those spiritual benefits of examining our life story, our autobiography, as a spiritual discipline, it's well established, folks, throughout our history. Remember I told you we go back to Augustine for this early and luminous example of this tradition. And then we go on to Teresa of Avila, John Henry Cardinal Neumann, St. Teresa of Lisieux, Thomas Merton, Venerable Pope John the 23rd, Pope John Paul II. I mean, dozens of books by contemporary authors trying to make sense of their lives. Leaving aside theology and psychology, the concern at this point is how do I go about examining my life story? It's easy to get overwhelmed and bogged down if we attempt to do too much too soon. Journaling is a form of paying attention. Journaling is a form of paying attention. In a sense, it's similar to the breathing exercise. You ever do that? In that we pay attention to what is going on within us. The difference is that we're not focusing on the movement of our breath, but on the movement of our inner concerns, our inner expectations, our inner attitudes. Our journal is focused on the present. What's going on in our lives now? We open ourselves to life and we experience it as fully as we are able. We pay attention to what is going on within us. Does a particular experience make us tense? Do we seek out certain expressions and then avoid others and experiences? Do we reject with disgust to a particular experience? Does a particular experience make us feel at peace? If we pay attention, we'll notice these reactions. I think the journal is a good place to record these reactions and any other fruits of our paying attention. Then once they are written down, we can try to understand our reactions, to see how they may be related, to follow them back to their source. Now I'm going to tell you something pathetic. Most of us go to spiritual direction once a month, and that's really, really good, and it's very hard to find a spiritual director. But because I have been privileged to have a number of priests and deacons who I do spiritual direction with. I go to spiritual direction once a week. Now, how ridiculous is that? What do I possibly have to say? And sometimes I can't always get to Joliet. It's just too big of a hike. Sometimes I'll meet my spiritual director halfway. Sometimes I can get to Joliet. Sometimes, we'll meet somewhere else. It just depends. But sometimes, folks, it's on the phone. Busted. But sometimes I simply say, my schedule will not permit, but I'm not going to miss this time. It is scheduled. And so I get on the phone. Now, what do I mostly do on the phone? I read my journal. I read the movement of the Spirit in my life. I read and it's just been an amazing grace. I don't think I'm a particularly good writer. I'm sincere about that. I'm not trying to blow smoke. And I think sometimes that, my spiritual director is going to fall asleep on the other end. And go, wow. But I got to tell you, that doesn't happen. Journaling is a tool for discernment. It allows us to consider the current experiences, the current struggles from many perspectives. It allows us to question the assumptions that underlie the experience and our perception of them. The fruit of journaling and other discernment-oriented disciplines is the ability to examine our own lives with the contemplative awareness and compassion that we would apply to any other focus of our attention. Contemplative awareness allows us to see things as they are. It allows us to see ourselves as we are. So does that help a little bit? Sorry about some of the personal examples, but that's just how it works in my life. All right. Can I go back to Merton a little bit? And then we'll take a break. And then do you see your handout? We are going to go through those various forms of prayer. One of the things that's kind of exciting is sometimes I'll go to Hootsuite and I'll hit some of your tweets or some of your, and it's like, that was from the talk. That was from the sharing. So sometimes take a look at that. It's kind of fun how the Holy Spirit works. Okay, let's just do a segue to Thomas Merton, then we'll take a quick break. The basic elements of Merton's story, from this youthful restlessness to spiritual maturity, I think have some very common threads in our own lives. His comments that lead up to this America's entrance into World War II, pay attention to some of that too. Pay attention to the context, the culture of the time, are very interesting, and they reveal a lot about the general public opinion of the time. Some people say he's a radical, he's a social activist, da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Okay, but I'm saying that we live in a particular culture. I remember going with Eric Groth a couple weeks ago to give a class to the deacons on social media. And let me just say, I'm the last guy, that's why I took him, to teach on social media. But boy, did it ever help me, because there's two sides of one coin, right? There's a lot to social media that's not good. It's like 50-50, There's 50% of it are like the pitfalls and 50% of it are like the possibilities. Let me just tell you, when it stops, person-to-person relationships, when people are just texting on their date night, are you kidding me? When people are sexting or bullying or whatever, things are said. That's the other thing. Oh, my Lord. I was so proud of one of our parishioners, and I even called her out, I'll just say it here to Terry Apple. Terry Apple sent out an email as soon as we made an announcement about Father Federspiel, and she said, we talked about it at our book club, and please respect the dignity of every human being and don't allow this to be reduced to gossip. Now, I'm telling you my take, but it was spot on. And it was so amazingly well done. And that's the problem with some of the social media. It can be done in a way that nobody has to put their name to it, nobody has to take ownership for, and some of the things that are said are absolutely from the pit of hell. And you can see what's happening in some of even our young people's lives, not just young, but people's lives. I mean, when they commit suicide because somebody's saying this about them on Facebook or whatever other social media, that's a serious problem. And you can't take those kinds of liberties. But there are also tremendous possibilities that can be gained from this source. I found the chapters about his early years the most intriguing. I don't know about you. Perhaps simply because his childhood was kind of unusual. It really wasn't my childhood. Playing in the French countryside, that sounded pretty good to me. Mostly alone and sometimes with other boys. Living for a time with his American pop, and the early death of his mother, moving from Provincetown to Bermuda to England with his father, hiking alone across Europe during holidays from his boarding school. I thought that was kind of cool. But also his retelling of those days seems to come to me, they came to him pretty easily, and with less internal turmoil than with what followed. So it's kind of adventurous, you know? It's kind of like a Tom Sawyer. I don't know if that was just me. That's probably not a good analogy, but the middle and the later chapters detailing his college and graduate school years really are emotionally complicated. Did you find that? Okay, thank you. For me, they were a little harder to read. I attribute this to my own disagreement with this fundamental tenet of his understanding of calling. I didn't really agree with that. Merton is really foremost an intellectual. I'm not in his league, but he emerges from his identity struggle seeing intellectual pursuits as worthy only in the service of one's sake. Not a surprising position for someone who ultimately finds his place, you know, as he did, in a very contemplative order. He doesn't quite explicitly state this position, but his denigration of his pre-conversion publishing aspirations, for example, his dissatisfaction with his literary studies, his eventual relief at pursuing writing again within the monastic community, all support this journey, this interpretation, if you will. His words occasionally have an anti-intellectual ring, but he was simply too much of a scholar. I think his book abundantly demonstrates this. I think he simply saw the subjugation of his intellectual gifts as necessary path to humility. For example, in one passage he wrote this: "The logic of worldly success rests on a fallacy, the strange error that our perfection depends on the thoughts and opinions and applause of other men. A weird life it is indeed, to be living always in somebody else's imagination, as if that were the only place in which one could at last become real." Now, this was a relief for him to remove his ideals and his gifts from the world and into a sacred space, where instead of dissertation advisors and chapbook publishers, he was free to think and write for an audience of one. It was the structure that ultimately gave him the confidence to take his spiritual service back out of the world as he became socially and politically more active in later years. Now, the intensity, the duration of his desire to understand himself in context is at times exhausting. Was it for you to read? Whew! I get kind of worn out. You know, I just see it very similar to a lot of our identity struggles. I certainly agree with him that souls are like athletes that need opponents worthy of them if they are to be tried and extended and pushed into the full use of their powers. And sometimes the toughest opponent is the self. I was right with him on that. But when I did grow weary of this one, I said, I was too miserable to know my own state's discussions. My perseverance was sometimes rewarded with a shining passage of pure descriptive narrative. The first comes in this recounting of a lot of things he did as an undergraduate. And this brief stint as a communist, and his brief, only slightly less regretted stint as a fraternity brother. We have a lot of that today, a lot of people that don't grow up. And so I can go on to that, but I don't want to, it just talks a little bit about that. I was going to give the quote. But the joy of the possibilities that go on are exciting. Greenwich Village, where he started his PhD program, I mean, I didn't live there, but I went to school right across the street on Perry, and it was kind of neat. There's a little plaque there, by the way, if you go, you can kind of see next to it the window where Thomas Merton was. And he says this: "I don't, as a matter of fact, remember anything very important happening over that period, except that I used to make dates with a nurse. Also, it was the occasion of a serious, sarcastic letters to a telephone company because of various kinds of troubles, mechanical, financial. So I was kind of listening to all that. So moving from this serious to the humorous, from theological to literary, Seven Storey Mountain really opens for me a window on the intellectual atmospheres of this first half of the 20th century. Reveals Merton's own personal history, sheds light on so many different things, monastic orders, educational institutions, religious and secular. He has been called the greatest example of Christian faith in action in the social history of the United States. That's pretty high praise. I can see some merit to that.